I want to start today by placing you in a scenario that I strongly suspect is going to feel incredibly familiar, especially if you were listening to this on your commute home after a truly grueling day on the wards.
It usually is a grueling day, isn't it?
Always. So, picture this. You are sitting in the doctor's mess, the coffee is lukewarm, the chairs have seen better decades, and you are speaking to a younger colleague. Let's say it's an ST5 registrar who is about to make a really hard career decision.
Right, a crossroads moment.
Exactly. They are weighing up two fellowships. One is this high-profile, incredibly glamorous lower limb arthroplasty fellowship in North America that will just look absolutely phenomenal on their CV.
Oh, the shiny object.
Yes, the shiny
Yeah.
object. And the other is a complex trauma fellowship in a slightly run down but clinically intense level 1 major trauma center right here in the UK.
I know exactly the type of choice you mean.
Right. So they are asking for your advice. You listen to them outline the pros and cons, the publication potentials, the networking opportunities, and then you offer your perspective. And as you speak, you actually surprise yourself a little bit. You articulate this profound, crystallized belief about the nature of our profession. You hear yourself saying something like, if you don't learn how to manage the absolute chaos of a polytraumatized patient at 3 a.m. right now, no amount of elective joint replacements in a pristine private facility will ever make you feel like a complete surgeon.
That is a brilliant piece of advice, by the way.
Well, thank you. But it's something you didn't quite realize you held with such absolute, unshakable conviction until you actually heard yourself say it out loud in that mess.
Yes. The articulation makes it real.
Exactly. The registrar nods, taking it in. The conversation concludes, their bleep goes off, and you both go back to your respective wards or theaters. But that thing you said, it keeps echoing in your head for the rest of the day. It lingers.
Because it wasn't just advice for them.
Precisely. Because in that fleeting, totally unscripted moment of mentorship, you are granted a sudden, startling glimpse of who you have become without you ever fully realizing that the becoming was even happening.
I mean, that is a remarkably powerful phenomenon, and it happens precisely because that echo, that sudden realization of your own internal architecture, is the manifestation of something that has been quietly compounding in the background for perhaps 10 or 15 years.
It's not spontaneous at all.
Not in the slightest. It isn't an accident. It isn't a sudden epiphany brought on by the lukewarm coffee. It is the direct result of thousands of micro decisions you have made since you were a core trainee.
Yeah, and that lingering echo, the realization of who you have actually become underneath the scrubs and the titles, is exactly what this deep dive is all about. So welcome to Deep Dive Ortho.
Oh, glad to be here.
Our mission today is to pull back the curtain and move completely beyond the metrics we are all so intensely conditioned to chase. Because, from medical school onwards, we spend our lives talking about the easily measurable currencies of medical career. We certainly do. We talk about our FRCS, we talk about the prestige of our fellowship locations, the impact factor of our publications, our clinical titles, our CQC ratings, and, the breadth of our professional networks.
And those things are entirely real. We operate in a system that demands them, and they certainly matter to a degree.
They do matter. But there is another form of professional currency that is drastically underrated, rarely spoken about in annual appraisals, and completely invisible on a CV. It is called identity capital.
Identity capital, yes.
We're looking at the premise that in the moments when an orthopedic career actually pivots, fractures, or demands a massive leap, it is almost never your credentials that carry you through. It is your sense of who you are and what you stand for.
I fundamentally agree with that premise. The central thesis we really need to examine today, and frankly deeply interrogate, is that identity capital does not magically appear when you need it.
You can't just download it.
Exactly. You cannot summon it on demand during a crisis in theater or a devastating morbidity and mortality meeting. It has to be built much earlier, incredibly slowly, and crucially, in small, unglamorous moments that most clinicians completely fail to recognize as important at the time.
Because we're so focused on the big goals.
We are culturally conditioned to focus on the grand milestones. The day you pass the fellowship exam, the day you are appointed as a substantive consultant. But identity capital isn't forged on the podium.
Where is it forged then?
It is forged on a wet Tuesday afternoon when you have to make a highly nuanced, incredibly difficult call regarding a compromised diabetic patient's operative management, knowing the outcome might absolutely ruin your personal audit data.
Oh, that's a brilliant example.
Or when you choose to have an uncomfortable, totally honest conversation with a grieving family rather than delegating it to your registrar and rushing off to the private clinic.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can understand how to actually use this capital or how it saves us, we must first rigorously define what it is, and perhaps more importantly, what it is not.
Right.
Let's get forensic here. How do we cleanly define this invisible currency in a way that makes absolute sense to a mid-career surgeon listening right now?
If we are to define it cleanly, I would say identity capital is the accumulated internal sense of who you are as a professional entity. It encompasses your deeply held clinical values, your distinct surgical and communication style, and your characteristic ways of thinking and responding under intense, acute pressure.
So it's your professional DNA, in a way.
Sort of, yes. It is the definitive collection of things you would absolutely categorically refuse to do, sitting right alongside the things you simply cannot help but do because they're so intrinsic to your nature.
Right.
Ultimately, it is the definitive answer to the question, what kind of clinician are you, when the answer cannot simply be a credential on a piece of paper.
It's not just a job title.
Exactly. It is not, I am a fellowship-trained, complex spinal deformity surgeon. It is the qualitative, uncompromising core of your professional existence. It is the heuristic, the internal shortcut that allows you to make decisions when the guidelines run out and the evidence is gray.
I love that distinction. It acts as a heuristic. It's the framework that remains when you strip away the titles, the GMC number, and the trust badge. But let's look at how that is actually formed.
Well, it comes from experience.
We know it comes from experience, obviously.
Yeah.
But you can't just accumulate 15 years on the orthopedic ward, do your thousands of joint replacements, and automatically assume you're building this capital. Time served does not equal character built.
Precisely. And this brings us to a crucial framework regarding the dichotomy of experience. This is something the medical profession fundamentally misunderstands.
How so?
Well, while identity capital is undeniably built from experience, not all experience builds it equally. In fact, you can have 3 decades of clinical experience and build almost zero identity capital.
Wow, 30 years and nothing to show for it internally.
Exactly. The experiences that actually build it are those demanding, active, painful engagement. It is built in the moments where you have to make a definitive choice between 2 bad options, where you take a firm stance on a controversial clinical management plan against the prevailing opinion of your department.
When you stick your neck out.
Yes. Where you stick with something profoundly hard like managing an infected periprosthetic joint revision that requires multiple washouts, vacuum dressings, and months of emotionally draining patient interactions, when it would have been so much easier to just transfer their care.
Right. The easy way out is always there.
It's built when you say no to something highly attractive, perhaps a lucrative private partnership, because it is fundamentally misaligned with your values. It's built when you discover physical and emotional limits you simply didn't know you had.
Wait, let me make sure I'm mapping this correctly. If those are the active, friction-heavy moments that build a capital, then conversely, the experiences that do not build it are the passive ones, the path of least resistance.
Exactly. The passive experiences are the silent killers of identity capital. It's going along with the crowd because it is politically expedient within the trust, deferring entirely to the prevailing departmental opinion, or worse, the loudest consultant in the room, without critically evaluating the patient's presentation yourself.
Oh, we've all seen that happen.
Merely performing a role, acting the part of the senior clinician with the right suit and the right car without actually embodying the deep responsibility, or simply coasting through the middle years of your career on autopilot, churning through elective lists without ever questioning your own practice.
Which is incredibly common, let's be honest.
It is. That sort of experience adds lines to a CV. It pays the mortgage.
Right.
But it adds zero density to your character.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this implies a rather stark reality about how we evaluate our peers and, frankly, how we hire them.
It does.
Let me pose a hypothetical to you, and I want to be very specific here. Could 2 clinicians have absolutely identical, stellar CVs, same prestigious medical school, same highly competitive rotation, same high-impact publications in the bone and joint journals, but possess entirely different levels of identity capital?
They absolutely can, and in clinical reality, they frequently do. Let's construct a scenario, not of specific individuals, but an archetype that anyone listening to this will instantly recognize.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine two orthopedic surgeons, Surgeon A and Surgeon B. On paper, if you are sitting on an interview panel, they are indistinguishable. They both secured the highly competitive fellowship. They both have the impressive publication record. Their complication rates appear well within national averages.
The dream candidates.
On paper, yes. However, Surgeon A spent the last decade optimizing entirely for the external visible metrics. When choosing research, they appended their name to massive multi-center retrospective data trawls solely for the citation count, regardless of whether they actually understood the methodology or believed the clinical relevance of the outcome.
Right.
In theater, they meticulously deferred difficult, boundary-pushing decisions to senior colleagues to avoid taking personal risk. They carefully managed their complication rates, not by being a better surgeon, but by patient selection.
Avoiding the complex, high-stakes, multi-morbid salvage cases that might blemish their pristine audit record.
Exactly. Cherry-picking the easy cases. Their internal sense of self remained entirely vague, defined exclusively by the applause of the institution and the external validation of their peers.
Right. They are essentially a mirror reflecting the institution's desires back at it. They've built a career on risk aversion and optical management. I think we all know Surgeon A. They usually end up on a lot of committees.
They certainly do. Now consider Surgeon B. Over those exact same 10 years, Surgeon B made a series of small, exceedingly difficult choices.
Okay.
They occasionally turned down lucrative opportunities, perhaps stepping away from a private clinic group because the culture felt commercially driven rather than patient-centered, which misaligned with their principles.
That takes guts.
In the NHS, they took on the complex salvage cases that others actively avoided, the massive BMI patients with terrible soft tissue envelopes, accepting that their personal complication metrics might inevitably suffer simply because they believed it was their fundamental clinical duty to treat the patient in front of them.
Because it's the right thing to do.
Yes, they spoke up in the morbidity and mortality meetings to take absolute ownership of an error. They stood at the front of the room and said, I placed that retractor too deep, I caused the neuropraxia, and here's how I'm changing my practice. They didn't obfuscate or blame the lighting or the scrub nurse.
Which Surgeon A would definitely do.
Exactly. Over the years, these small, often painful choices revealed and subsequently reinforced their character. Surgeon B possesses immense identity capital. Surgeon A possesses merely a polished, very fragile veneer.
So what does this all mean in the real world? Because I have to push back a little here on behalf of the listener.
Please do.
If this capital compounds so quietly over years of microscopic, difficult choices, we need to examine exactly when this investment actually pays out. Because let's be honest, in the modern healthcare system, the clinician optimizing for the external metric Surgeon A seems to be winning for a very long time.
They do appear to be winning, yes.
They get the promotions, they get the private referrals, they get the easy life. Where does the clinician with high identity capital actually survive, where the one without it fails? Because if it's completely invisible, what's the point?
That is the absolute pivotal question. You are right, Surgeon A will appear to be winning. But the illusion of Surgeon A's success only shatters when the system places them under a specific, intense type of load.
Right.
And it will. There are roughly 5 distinct, inevitable moments in a medical career where identity capital isn't just a nice philosophical concept to have. It is absolutely critical for professional survival. These are what we call the payout moments. When the system stresses the structure, you find out very quickly what it's built from.
I love that. When the system stresses the structure. Let's dive deeply into these 5 payout moments because, as you said, they are inevitable. The first payout moment is career transitions.
Yes.
And we see this constantly. Choosing a new role, transitioning from a senior registrar to a newly appointed consultant, or moving your practice to a new trust almost always feels like a giant tick box exercise of visible capital. You look at the salary banding, the geographical location, the prestige of the hospital, the secretarial support, your access to the robotic-assisted theater list. It is all extremely tangible.
It is entirely tangible, and it is entirely woefully insufficient for making a sound, sustainable career decision.
How so?
When you are navigating a career transition, identity capital is the sole mechanism that tells you if a role truly fits you internally. It acts as your internal compass. Without it, clinicians make decisions based exclusively on those tangible metrics you just listed. They look at the prestige of a tertiary referral center and assume that simply walking through those doors will confer that prestige onto them, filling whatever internal professional void they have. They think, if I'm a consultant at this famous hospital, I must be a great surgeon.
And what happens when they actually take that role, when the reality of Monday morning hits?
They land in positions that look absolutely phenomenal on paper. Their family is incredibly impressed. Their former medical school peers are openly envious on LinkedIn. But the day-to-day reality of the role feels entirely hollow, or worse, fundamentally toxic inside.
It doesn't match the brochure.
Exactly. They might find themselves in a department that prioritizes high-volume, rapid turnover arthroplasty at the absolute expense of the meticulous, patient-centered care they actually value. But because they lacked the identity capital to recognize their own core values, they didn't know to screen for this during the interview process. They didn't ask the hard questions.
Whereas Surgeon B would have spotted it immediately.
The surgeon with high identity capital can walk into an interview at a highly prestigious, world-renowned unit, sense the cultural misalignment, perhaps noticing how the seniors speak about the juniors, or the relentless focus on throughput over outcomes, and they can walk away.
They can just say no to the prestige.
Yes, they are perfectly comfortable saying, this is a wonderful opportunity, it has all the bells and whistles, but it is not who I am, and it will destroy me.
That requires an immense amount of self-assurance. To turn down the shiny object because you know your own internal architecture won't support it. Which brings us seamlessly, or rather causally, to the second payout moment, hard ethical moments.
Ah, yes, the ethical tests.
Because often you don't even have to change jobs to be tested. These are the situations where a clinician is asked or pressured to do something that violates a deeply held value. And let's be real, it's rarely overt corruption. It's almost never someone handing you a briefcase of cash to alter coding.
No, it's never that obvious.
It is usually something deeply insidious, systemic, and quiet.
Yes, the quiet pressures are by far the most dangerous because they're so easily rationalized. Let me give you a very specific orthopedic example.
Okay.
You are being pressured by hospital management or a clinical director to clear a patient for elective joint arthroplasty when the clinical indications are entirely marginal. Let's say it's an 85-year-old patient with radiographically severe knee osteoarthritis, bone and bone, but clinically they have minimal pain, they're walking 2 miles a day, and their primary issue is a bit of stiffness.
A very common scenario.
Very common. But the department is falling behind on its surgical targets for the quarter, the waiting list initiative is in full swing, and management needs the list filled to hit the numbers. The systemic pressure on you to simply say, well, the x-ray looks awful, let's list them, is immense.
And this is where the mechanics of refusal become so vital.
Yeah.
I want to dig into the actual mechanism here. How does identity capital function in that exact micro moment, sitting in the clinic room with the manager's email pinging on your desktop? Why does it lower the cognitive load of saying no?
Because identity capital acts as a heuristic, a cognitive shortcut. Refusal isn't just about being stubborn or argumentative. It's about having an absolute bedrock to stand upon.
Right.
If you have spent 10 years building identity capital, you know exactly who you are. You know that your core identity as a clinician is predicated on uncompromising, evidence-based indications and doing no harm.
So the decision's already made before the email even arrived.
Exactly. Therefore, the refusal to operate on that marginal patient doesn't require a massive internal debate. It is almost automatic. You don't sit there weighing the political pros and cons of angering the clinical director versus the risk of the operation. The boundary is pre-decided.
That makes so much sense.
It is not a crisis of conscience. It is simply a boundary being enforced. You say, no, the clinical picture does not support the intervention. I will not list them.
But for the clinicians without that capital, Surgeon A.
People lacking identity capital tend to comply. And they comply simply because they do not have a firm grasp on what core principles they would even be defending. They feel the discomfort in their stomachs, certainly. They know it's probably not the right thing to do.
But they do it anyway.
But when the medical director applies pressure, they immediately rationalize it. They tell themselves, well, the x-ray's terrible, they'll need it eventually, or everyone else in the department is listing these cases, or I need to be a team player to get that new theater equipment.
Oh, the rationalizations are endless.
They bend because there is no rigid internal structure, no identity capital to prevent the bending. And here is the tragedy. Every single time they bend, they erode whatever fragile sense of self they had left. They become a little more cynical, a little more compliant, and a little less of a doctor.
That is a chilling reality. The slow, imperceptible erosion of the self through compliance. It's death by 1,000 minor compromises. Now, if we survive the ethical pressures, we still have to face the third payout moment, which I think is perhaps the most visceral, terrifying reality for anyone in surgical practice. Recovery from setbacks.
The hardest payout moment of all.
We're talking about dealing with a catastrophic surgical complication, a malpractice lawsuit, a profound professional loss, or a high-profile failure. And here's where I want to push back again, because how does identity really dictate recovery here?
Go on.
Surely, the objective severity of the complication matters more than the internal psychological state of the surgeon. If you are doing a complex posterior wall acetabular fracture fixation and you accidentally cause an iatrogenic sciatic nerve palsy,
A nightmare scenario.
the patient wakes up with a foot drop that might never recover. A severed nerve is a severed nerve. The biology doesn't care about your identity capital. The General Medical Council doesn't care about your internal architecture. Doesn't that external event totally override everything else?
The severity of the physical complication absolutely dictates the patient's reality, and we must never minimize that. But it does not dictate the surgeon's long-term professional or psychological trajectory.
Okay, explain that.
What's fascinating here, and what the psychological literature on surgical trauma shows us, is that while the external event is the catalyst, the trajectory of the recovery relies almost entirely on the question of who you are.
Right.
When a catastrophic complication occurs, when that patient wakes up with the foot drop, the external scaffolding of your ego is instantly violently demolished. The fact that you went to Oxford doesn't help you. The letters after your name do not soothe the crushing guilt when you have to walk into the relative's room and explain what you did. Your publications are meaningless in that moment.
Right. In that moment, the external metrics suddenly feel entirely irrelevant, maybe even a bit mocking. The visible CV offers zero comfort.
Exactly. So the critical question is, how do you rebuild from ground zero? Clinicians with immense identity capital rebuild cleanly. Let me explain what I mean by cleanly.
Yes, please do.
Because they have spent years building an internal structure, they are able to psychologically separate their inherent worth as a human being and a dedicated professional from the specific acute failure of that moment.
They don't equate the failure with their entire being.
Because they know who they are, a committed, rigorous, compassionate surgeon who operates in a high-stakes, inherently risky environment, they can look at the failure objectively. They can integrate the error rather than compartmentalizing it.
Right.
They dissect the technical failure, they present it honestly at M&M, they implement systemic changes, and they return to theater with a mature, deeply integrated understanding of their own fallibility. They are forever changed, they are more cautious, but they do not shatter.
That concept of integration is vital. They weave the failure into their identity as a cautionary thread, rather than letting it burn the whole tapestry. And what about those who lack this capital, those who built their entire identity purely on external validation and the illusion of surgical perfection?
For them, a major setback is not just a clinical failure, it is an existential annihilation. Because their entire internal operating system is coded as, I am exactly as good as my last complication rate, or I am the flawless surgeon, a severe complication destroys their entire definition of self. There is no foundation underneath the perfectionism.
So what happens to them? Do they just quit?
Sometimes. But often those clinicians fail to recover fully in other ways. The psychological term is maladaptive coping. They might develop debilitating defensive medical practices, suddenly refusing to take on any case with even a hint of complexity, passing the buck to colleagues.
We see that all the time.
Or they might become intensely hostile, blaming the nursing staff, the anesthetist, or even the patient's anatomy to protect their fragile ego. Or they return to work as a permanently diminished, smaller version of themselves, forever haunted by an error they simply lacked the internal density to process and integrate.
That is profound. The stark difference between integrating an error and being entirely consumed by it. But even if you survive a catastrophic complication cleanly, you still have to face the opposite problem.
Which is?
The times when nothing goes drastically wrong, but nothing goes exceptionally right either. Which leads us to the fourth payout moment. It's less dramatic than a lawsuit or a severed nerve, but arguably far more common and cumulatively draining. Long stretches without external reward.
Ah, yes.
The grind, Every medical career, no matter how stellar, involves periods of sheer grinding invisibility. You're 10 years into being a consultant. The initial shine has worn off. You're doing your 500th primary hip replacement. The clinical burdens are immense. The system feels fundamentally unfair. The NHS waiting lists are insurmountable. And the recognition, the clinical excellence awards, the academic promotions, seems to be going to people who perhaps deserve it less or who are simply better at playing the political game. It's the slow burn. How do you survive that?
This is the hidden marathon of a medical career. The glamorous moments, the life-saving trauma surgeries, the awards are incredibly brief. The vast majority of your career will be spent in these long, invisible stretches. The Tuesday morning clinic with 40 patients, the 2 a.m. trauma list fixing a fractured neck, a femur with the skeletal scrub team.
It's relentless.
The ability to survive this decade-long stretch without becoming deeply cynical relies entirely on your internal reward mechanisms. The expert clinician, the one who survives and actually thrives in these stretches, operates on a very specific internal frequency.
Okay.
Their core operating belief is, I know what I am doing and I know precisely why I am doing it. Their satisfaction is derived from the quiet, entirely uncelebrated mastery of their craft. For them, executing the perfect reduction of a complex ankle fracture at 2 in the morning with no audience other than the tired scrub nurse and the anesthetist is enough. It fills their cup.
Because their capital is internal, their reward mechanism is also internal. They don't need the chief executive to hand them a certificate to know they did a good job.
Yeah, precisely. The joy is in the work itself. Now, contrast that with the clinician who relies exclusively on visible capital. Their internal operating system is completely outsourced. It relies on the premise, I am what other people say I am.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. When the external praise inevitably dries up, when the promotions stall because of trust politics, when the system ignores their extra hours, they begin to psychologically starve. They break down, they become embittered, they suffer extreme burnout.
So burnout isn't just about working too hard.
And it is crucial to understand this. They burn out not necessarily because the clinical work is too physically hard, but because the work is no longer providing the external validation they require to sustain their fragile, externally dependent identity. Burnout, in many cases, is a symptom of starved external validation when there is no internal capital to fall back on.
It is the ultimate vulnerability, isn't it? If you outsource your identity to the hospital trust, you are entirely at their mercy. You've handed them the keys to your self-worth, and eventually the system demands everything back.
It always does.
Which brings us to the final, unavoidable payout moment. The end of a career. The retirement cliff. We often view retirement as a purely administrative or financial transition. If you ask a 60-year-old surgeon about retirement, they talk about their NHS pension pot, reducing their on-call sessions gradually, maybe handing over the clinical lead duties. They talk logistics. But we rarely talk about the psychological cliff edge, the sudden void.
Yes, and this raises an important question about how we view the entire arc of a life in medicine.
Yeah.
Retirement hits identity capital the hardest of all the payout moments because it is absolute and final.
Right.
Think about it. For 30 years, this clinician has walked into a room, a ward, a theater, a clinic, and instantly commanded respect simply by virtue of their title. They are the consultant. They speak, and people literally write down what they say.
They have immense power.
If a clinician's entire sense of self, their entire ego, was loaded onto that specific job title, retirement is violently disorienting. The day after retirement, they wake up and their opinion is no longer sought. Their security badge no longer opens the theater doors. Their schedule, once dictated by the frantic pace of the hospital, is entirely blank. The external scaffolding vanishes overnight. It is a profound loss of relevance.
It must feel like an ego death. To go from being a god in the operating theater to just another person in the queue at the supermarket.
It is exactly an ego death for those who lack identity capital. I have seen brilliant surgeons spiral into severe depression within 6 months of retiring because they didn't know how to exist without a scalpel in their hand.
That's heartbreaking.
However, those who build identity capital alongside their clinical role land much more softly. They recognize that being an orthopedic surgeon was an incredible, meaningful role they played magnificently for decades, but it was not the totality of their human existence.
They are more than just their job.
Yes, their character, Their deep curiosity, their love of mentoring, their analytical mind, their compassion, these traits remain intact regardless of whether they hold a clinical contract. They transition seamlessly into advisory roles or charity work or entirely new hobbies because their core identity was never entirely dependent on the hospital's permission to exist. They know who they are, with or without the scrubs.
So we have these 5 crucible moments. Transitions where you must rely on your internal compass. Ethical dilemmas where you must enforce your boundaries. Setbacks where you must rebuild your shattered ego. Invisible stretches where you must find internal reward. And retirement where you must face the void.
They are inevitable for any mid-senior professional listening to us right now. You simply cannot dodge them.
So the urgent practical question becomes actionable. How do we actively manufacture this capital before the crisis hits? We know it compounds over time, but what are the actual daily mechanisms of compounding? Because frankly, no one teaches this in medical school.
No, they certainly don't. But the architecture of character is not a mystery. It isn't some ethereal genetic trait. It is built through very specific, intentional, repeatable practices. I want to present a clear framework we can apply here, consisting of 4 distinct practices.
Brilliant.
But I must warn you and the listeners, none of them are easy, none of them are comfortable, and none of them yield immediate external rewards. They require discipline.
The best things rarely do. Let's go through them in detail. Practice 1 is reflection on hard moments. This sounds simple enough in theory. Taking time after a difficult decision, a bad surgical outcome, or an ethical dilemma to actually think about what it revealed about you rather than just moving on. But in practice, this feels almost impossible.
It feels impossible because the primary enemy of this practice is the modern clinical workflow itself.
Oh, absolutely.
The entire healthcare system is designed for relentless forward momentum. You have a complex complication in theater, maybe a catastrophic bleed you barely managed to control. Your adrenaline is spiking. You finally finish the case. But the moment the patient is wheeled into the recovery room, the bed manager is on the intercom demanding to know when the next patient is being sent for.
There is no pause button.
Exactly. The system demands that you immediately compartmentalize the trauma, wash your hands, and move on to the next hip replacement. The system does not allow time for reflection.
So how does one actually reflect? If you're listening to this on your commute right now, ask yourself, when was the last time you genuinely processed a clinical failure? Because we aren't talking about writing poetry in the doctor's mess or sitting cross-legged in meditation, are we? What is the actual mechanism?
No, we are not talking about journaling for its own sake or engaging in abstract, self-indulgent philosophical rumination. We are talking about ruthless, structured internal inquiry. It often happens in the car ride home.
Right. The commute.
After a difficult case or a sharp conflict, the clinicians who actively build capital force themselves to pause. They sit in the silence of their car and ask deeply uncomfortable, piercing questions. What did my reaction in that moment tell me about myself?
That's a tough question to answer, honestly.
It is. When the bleeding started, did I freeze? Did I lash out and shout at the scrub team because I was terrified and I lack emotional regulation? In the clinic, did I make a conservative, non-operative choice because it was genuinely better for the patient, or secretly because I was afraid of the risk to my own audit data?
Wow.
Sitting with those questions, refusing to look away from your own flaws, turns the raw, chaotic noise of clinical trauma into the dense structural material of identity capital. Most clinicians skip this step because it hurts. The ones who do not skip it evolve.
It requires an enormous amount of vulnerability with oneself. To admit, I shouted because I was scared, rather than I shouted because the nurse handed me the wrong instrument. And that deep self-knowledge is required for practice too, which I think is the hardest one. Principled refusals. Saying no on principle to things that contradict who you are.
It is arguably the most difficult practice, yes.
I have to say, thinking back to the memory of the very first time I had to say no to a senior stakeholder, it was a clinical director asking me to alter a patient pathway in a way I felt seriously compromised patient safety to save money. It was utterly terrifying. My heart was pounding. I felt physically ill. I was convinced I was going to be fired or ostracized.
A completely natural biological response to confronting authority.
And I want to push back here on behalf of junior colleagues. It's easy for a tenured senior consultant to preach about principled refusals. But if I'm a year 2 registrar, my visible CV is literally my lifeline. If I say no to a toxic principal investigator's flawed research project, I lose my shot at the spinal fellowship. How can you expect junior surgeons to prioritize this invisible capital when the system strictly, ruthlessly rewards compliance?
That is a profoundly valid challenge. The power dynamics in medicine are incredibly steep, and the fear of career suicide is real. I am not suggesting a junior registrar recklessly burns bridges or becomes aggressively insubordinate.
Okay, so what does it look like for them?
Here's what I am saying. Identity capital must start somewhere. A principled refusal doesn't have to be a screaming match with the clinical director. It can be a polite, firm, heavily documented, I am not comfortable proceeding with this without discussing it with my educational supervisor, or I cannot put my name to this paper as I did not contribute to the methodology.
So it's about setting a boundary, even a small one.
Yes, that physical reaction you described, the pounding heart, the nausea, is entirely normal. It is a biological sign that you are standing exactly at the frontier of your identity. Each principled refusal, no matter how small or diplomatically phrased, is a deposit into your identity capital account. And the psychological compounding effect here is fascinating.
How does it compound? Does the fear ever actually go away?
The first refusals are excruciating precisely because you lack a track record of independence. You are stepping out of the herd for the first time, and your evolutionary fear of ostracization kicks in. But it gets exponentially easier.
Why is that?
Because subsequent refusals are no longer radical departures from your norm. They are simply the maintenance of a pattern you have already established. You prove to yourself that you can survive the social discomfort of saying no. You learn that the sky does not fall. You do not lose your job.
And people start to expect it of you.
And in fact, counterintuitively, you often gain the deep, albeit sometimes grudging, respect of the very people you opposed. Once that pattern is established, saying no to misaligned projects, to toxic colleagues, to unreasonable administrative demands becomes as natural as breathing. You build a reputation. People stop asking you to do shady things because they know what the answer will be.
It's the muscle of integrity. And like any muscle, you have to tear it slightly, endure the soreness to build it. Let's look at practice 3, taking a position. This involves actively engaging in teaching, writing, speaking, or mentoring.
Yes.
Now, a lot of clinicians do these things simply to pad their CVs. They do the obligatory teaching sessions to get their tick in the box for their ARCP. How does this actually build the invisible capital if everyone is doing it just for the points?
The intention changes the outcome. This brings us to the mechanism of articulation. Think about your own department. Why do the truly great educators in our field, the ones trainees flock to, seem to possess such robust, unshakable identities?
That's a good point. They usually do.
It is not a coincidence. Engaging in authentic teaching or writing forces you to crystallize your internal chaos into a coherent external structure. You cannot effectively teach a complex surgical approach or write a definitive opinion piece on healthcare ethics if your own thoughts are a muddy puddle. You cannot teach what you do not deeply understand.
Right. You have to actually know what you believe before you can stand in front of a room and convince a skeptical audience of ST3s.
Exactly. Articulating what you think makes the thinking real. When you stand in front of a room of sharp, questioning registrars and explain not just the how of a procedure, but the why you prefer a lateral approach to the hip in this specific instance, why you would never do that specific osteotomy on a smoker, what your personal thresholds for acceptable risk are, you are publicly stating a claim to your professional identity.
You're putting a flag in the ground.
You are laying your clinical soul bare. Therefore, clinicians who actively and authentically teach and mentor build identity capital faster than anyone else because they are constantly stress testing their own beliefs in the public arena. When a smart trainee asks, "But why do you do it that way?" Why? You have to have an answer that goes deeper than, "Because that's how I was taught."
I love that concept. Mentorship as a crucible for your own character. You refine yourself by teaching others. And that connects beautifully to our final mechanism, practice 4. Proximity to respected people. Spending deliberate, concentrated time with senior colleagues whose identity capital you deeply respect.
It's vital.
It reminds me of the absolute core of clinical apprenticeship. We spend years learning surgical techniques by standing opposite the operating table. We watch how a master surgeon holds the retractor, how delicately they handle the soft tissue, how they hold the drill. But we are also, perhaps subconsciously, learning character by proximity, aren't we?
We are, without question. Identity is not forged in a vacuum. It is not forged in total isolation. It is deeply, fundamentally social. We are osmotic creatures. We absorb the norms of the people around us.
So if you're surrounded by bad habits,
if you spend your formative years as a registrar surrounded by cynical, corner-cutting, externally driven clinicians who constantly complain about the NHS and treat patients as annoyances, that toxicity will inevitably seep into your own internal architecture, no matter how strong or idealistic you think you are.
it's unavoidable.
Conversely, if you deliberately seek out one or two senior colleagues who quietly model profound self-knowledge, absolute integrity, and grace under pressure, their character will subtly shape yours.
It is about actively choosing your models carefully, rather than just accepting whoever is assigned to you on the rota.
Yes. You watch how they behave outside the sterile field. You watch how they deliver devastating news to a patient's family, the quiet dignity they maintain, the refusal to rush the conversation because they are running late for clinic.
It's the small things.
You watch how they behave in a contentious departmental governance meeting when their budget is cut, maintaining a measured analytical response rather than throwing a temper tantrum. You absorb their internal pacing. Finding those people and staying as close to them as possible is perhaps the most efficient shortcut to building your own capital. You borrow their strength until you have built your own.
So we have these 4 incredibly robust practices. Ruthlessly reflecting on hard moments on the car ride home, engaging in the terrifying but necessary act of principled refusals, taking clear position by forcing yourself to teach the why, and maintaining proximity to respected, high-character mentors.
That's the framework, yes.
But I want to address a very real, very pragmatic anxiety that an ambitious, driven, mid-career listener might be feeling right now.
Let's hear it.
So what does this all mean for my actual CV? Let's be brutally honest. If I dedicate all this time and psychological energy to this internal building, to saying no to prestigious but misaligned committees, to reflecting quietly instead of churning out another retrospective case series, to spending an hour with a grieving family instead of seeing 3 more private patients, do I sacrifice the visible career?
I see where you're going.
Do I end up as a highly principled, profoundly self-aware clinician whom absolutely nobody's ever heard of, working in an underfunded peripheral hospital, passed over for every promotion?
That is a very common, very pervasive, and entirely understandable fear. We are trained to fear invisibility. But it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how professional ecosystems actually operate at the highest levels.
Okay, clarify that for me.
I want to firmly reassure the listener. Identity capital and visible capital, the credentials, the titles, the global reputation, are not fundamentally opposed to one another. It is not a zero-sum game where one trades against the other.
They don't cancel each other out.
In fact, if you look at the absolute apex of our profession, the clinicians with the most immense identity capital almost uniformly possess profoundly impressive visible careers. The 2 forms of capital actually compound together.
How? Make that make sense for me. If you are actively turning down opportunities because of principled refusals, surely your visible output decreases. You are publishing less, you are on fewer committees.
If you look at the upstream and downstream dynamic, the picture becomes clear. The core principle here is that a truly sustainable, globally respected, visible career is strictly downstream of the internal one.
Meaning the internal has to come first.
Exactly. Let's think about what earns true, lasting prestige in the surgical community. It isn't saying yes to every single administrative committee and burning out. It is delivering exceptional, reliable clinical excellence over decades.
Right.
It is producing research that asks deeply relevant, challenging, paradigm-shifting questions, rather than just churning out minor variations of existing data to pad a CV. It is being a mentor that the brightest, most capable trainees actively fight to work with.
And all of those things, the excellence, the brave research, the magnetism for good trainees, require immense identity capital.
Exactly. The visible recognition, the invitations to give keynote lectures at national conferences, the presidencies of specialist societies, these titles frequently arrive precisely because the clinician was diligently building something deeper underneath.
The success is a byproduct.
The surgical community is incredibly perceptive over the long term. They can spot the difference between someone who is merely ambitious and someone who possesses genuine gravity. Gravity is the external manifestation of identity capital. It's the weight of your character. When you have gravity, the opportunities begin to seek you out. And more importantly, they are the right opportunities, the ones aligned with your true capabilities, not just random shiny objects.
I love that phrase, genuine gravity. But what happens when the order is reversed? Because we all know people who chase the titles first. The clinicians who view the CV as the architectural blueprint rather than the byproduct of good work.
We certainly do.
They sprint for the visible capital, the fellowships, the directorships, hoping the internal substance will somehow magically fill in later. They build the facade and hope the foundation pours itself.
That is a recipe for a very specific, very tragic kind of professional collapse. Building the visible side without the internal foundation leaves a clinician holding a portfolio of credentials they simply cannot live up to when real pressure is applied.
They become a hollow chocolate bunny. Looks fantastic on the shelf, perfectly wrapped in foil, but the moment you put any pressure on it, it snaps into pieces because there's nothing inside.
That is a brilliant analogy. Yes. The hollowed chocolate bunny. They become the clinical director of a major trauma center, but they completely lack the internal fortitude to handle a genuine crisis, like a mass casualty event or a major CQC failure.
Right, because the letters after their name can't make the hard decisions for them.
Precisely. They achieve the professorship, but they have no original, deeply held philosophical stance to impart to their students. They are a hollow structure. When the wind blows, when a major complication hits, or a colleague challenges them, they collapse inward.
It's a house of cards.
And this is the most critical takeaway I can offer on this dynamic. You cannot credential your way into knowing who you are. You cannot append enough letters after your name to cure imposter syndrome if the imposter syndrome is actually rooted in a genuine, objective lack of internal substance.
That is so true.
The internal work has to be its own thing. It must be done for its own reasons, in the quiet, unglamorous moments, entirely divorced from the expectation of applause.
You cannot credential your way into knowing who you are. That is a phrase that is going to stick with me for a very long time. It perfectly encapsulates everything we have unpacked today. Let's synthesize this deep dive for everyone listening, whether you are an ST3 just starting to feel the pressure or a senior consultant staring down the barrel of retirement.
It applies to all of us.
We have explored identity capital, the vital form of professional currency that absolutely nobody puts on a CV, but which strictly dictates the ultimate trajectory of your life in medicine. We've learned it is built slowly, deliberately by clinicians who take the concept of their own becoming seriously.
Slowly being the operative word.
It's unglamorous, it is quiet, and it is forged in the fires of hard choices, principled refusals, rigorous reflection in the car ride home, and the sheer courage to articulate your truth to the next generation. It is the most consequential work of your professional life.
Absolutely.
Because when the healthcare system applies pressure during a tricky career transition, a quiet ethical crisis, a devastating clinical setback, the grinding silence in the middle years, or the void of retirement, it is the only thing that will keep you standing. The credentials will not save you. The character will. Before we finish, I want to give you, the listener, a direct, practical exercise. Sometime today, I want you to sit down and write down just one moment from the last 12 months when you discovered something new about who you are as a clinician. It might have been a moment of failure, a moment of surprising courage in theater, or a quiet realization during a routine clinic. That moment is your identity capital. Notice what it told you and hold on to it. And if today's deep dive gave you a new lens on your career or articulated something you have been feeling but could not quite name, please take a second to rate and share Deep Dive Ortho with a colleague who might need to hear it. The conversation only grows when we share it.
Before we close, I want to offer one last unmentioned extrapolation for you to mull over. Let's circle all the way back to the very first scenario we discussed at the beginning of this hour, the younger colleague coming to you for advice in the doctor's mess. Throughout this deep dive, we have framed identity capital as something you build for your own survival, your own resilience. But consider this. Without realizing it, you are now the senior figure whose proximity is actively shaping someone else's identity capital.
Oh, wow.
Every single time you react to a complication, every time you speak about a patient when you think no one is listening, every time you choose integrity over expediency, that junior colleague is watching. You are their environment. What quiet, unglamorous choices are they absorbing from you today? Your character is no longer just your own. It is the blueprint for the next generation of surgeons.
An incredibly powerful and, frankly, humbling thought to leave on.
Mm-hmm.
We're not just building ourselves, we are building the future of the profession through our daily example. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Talk soon.